It's my pleasure to host this session this evening. I don't know whether any of you were here at the last Ask With Forum meeting that took place last month when Charles Payne, sociologist from Duke, was here to talk with us. He gave a very interesting and, I thought, provocative talk called A Curse on Both Their Houses, Liberal and Conservative Theories of Urban School Change. Although he kind of self-identified as a progressive, I thought it was a quite even-handed talk. But at the end of the talk, one of the first questioners who stood up said, "Wouldn't it have been nice to have the Thurnstroms on the stage with you?" And Charles looked a little startled at that comment, but said, "Well, you certainly should have the Thurnstroms and hear from them." And although we couldn't produce them instantaneously that evening, they are here with us tonight to talk about their new book called No Excuses, Closing the Racial Gap in Learning. Stephan Thernstrom is the Winthrop Professor of History at Harvard. He's been on the faculty here for 30 or so years. One of the country's most distinguished social historians, best known, at least in these parts, I suspect, for an early book of his called The Other Bostonians, which won a Bancroft Prize. Abigail Thernstrom is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where Steve also has an affiliation. She is probably best known in these parts for her spirited service on the Massachusetts Board of Education. She's also a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Like her husband, she has a doctorate from Harvard, in her case from the government department, and is also an independently published author. Together, several years ago, they wrote a book on race relations in America called America in Black and White, One Nation Indivisible, a book that was very respectfully reviewed kind of across the political spectrum. Henry Louis Gates, for example, said about that book, rarely has a brief for e pluribus unum been argued more cogently or passionately. This book is essential reading for anyone wishing to understand the state of race relations at the end of the great American century. They've now tackled what I take to be the most difficult, thorny problem in American education, namely the persistent gap in achievement between white students and students of color. Their analysis is obviously driven by a deep passion for social justice and a sense of moral outrage that despite our progress in many other aspects of race relations in this country, we have been unable to make any significant dent in this problem. Their analysis and their proposed solutions are provocative and directly confront much conventional wisdom in this field. After their presentation, there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments from the floor. I will return to moderate that discussion, which I trust will be both spirited and civil. Please join me in welcoming the Thurnstroms. And Abby, you're going to go first? Yes. Good.
Well, I go first. Not because women go first, but because I do, in general, a kind of overview. And Steve tries to zero in, and I haven't even asked him what exactly he's zeroing in on this evening, but he generally zeroes in on one aspect of our research and tries to take a close look at how we've thought about it and what the problems in doing research on that aspect were for us, and questions that remain, and so forth. The more I talk about this book, the more impressed I am with the degree to which we do not have answers to the why question on the racial gap in academic achievement. And this is an area of public policy, American education, that is wide open to further research. And so in a way, our book is an invitation to that further research. The questions are endless, but in any case, I'll talk about what we tried to do and the questions that we tried to pose and some of the information that we got. Everybody knows 50 years since Brown versus Board of Education coming up on May 17th, and Brown promised much and raised our expectations, and I think it delivered much. I mean, we no longer have legally sanctioned segregation in this country, and I don't think we have resegregation either, and we'd be delighted to talk about that in the question period. We do have a lot of racially identifiable schools, which I think is very different than the problem that Brown attacked. But there was one sentence in Brown, some of you may recall who've read the decision. Decision was, you know, you feel like saying, where was the beef? It's a tiny little opinion. But in any case, one sentence that referred to equal educational opportunity. And that, as I said, did raise enormous and unfulfilled expectations. We're nowhere near having in this country equal educational opportunity. Professor Schwartz said that the racial gap in academic achievement between blacks and Hispanics on the one hand, whites and Asians on the other hand, and it is important, by the way, to see it that way. It's not a black-white gap. It's blacks and Latinos or Hispanics, whatever word you want to use. You can also use, obviously, African Americans for blacks, and whites and Asians on the other hand. And in some respects, Asians are doing much better than whites. But in any case, he called it a persistent and a thorny problem. Steve hates the word crisis. I do think it's an educational crisis. But it's also the nation's most important civil rights problem. It's an American tragedy, in my view, and a national emergency for which there are no good excuses. And hence the title of our book, No Excuses. Unequal skills and knowledge, not unequal years spent warming a seat in school. You can't look at education in terms of counting the number of years kids have spent in school, whether they've got a high school degree or a college degree. Unequal skills and knowledge are the main source today of ongoing racial inequality. That wasn't true yesterday. It is true today. And racial inequality, need I tell you, is America's great unfinished business. The American dilemma continues to be our major domestic issue. People who have equal skills and knowledge will have equal earnings across racial and ethnic groups. There is very good economic literature today on that question. In writing No Excuses, Steve and I, above all, wanted to create an overdue sense of outrage. We have a vision of what needs to be done, and we don't believe that tinkering around the edges of educational reform are going to do it. And we describe some fabulous schools, inner city schools, that are getting great results with kids who are normally tragically disconnected from the world of academic learning. But our first aim was to paint a picture not only of the gap, but also of the very limited usefulness of such conventional explanations as racial isolation, inadequate funding, class size, uncredentialed teachers, and the like. None of them, in our view, stand up to close scrutiny. And we wanted as well to make clear the dismaying failure of programs like Head Start and Title I, which have done nothing significant to level the playing field. Let's take a brief look first at what the gap looks like. But as a preliminary note, I should say, it's always necessary to say that this, in our view, is not an IQ problem. It is a story of kids who need to acquire skills and knowledge and have been tragically and needlessly left behind. So, some numbers on NAEP, National Assessment for Educational Progress, nation's most reliable test. Typical black or Hispanic student at age 17 is scoring less well than 80% of his or her white or Asian classmates. On average, these non-Asian minorities are 4 years behind those who are white and Asian. They are finishing high school with a junior high school education, so that the employer hiring the typical black high school student or the college who admits the average African American student is in effect choosing a youngster who has made it only through 8th grade. Here's another way of looking at the magnitude of the gap. In 5 out of 7 of the subjects tested by NAEP, a majority of black students fall into the lowest category, which is below basic. And it means that a majority of black students do not even have a partial knowledge of the mastery of the skills and knowledge expected of students in the 12th grade. If we switch our gaze from the bottom to the very top, the news is no happier. Let's take math. In math, only 0.2% of black students fall into NAEP's advanced category. The figure for whites is 11 times as high. The figure for Asians is 37 times as high. And Hispanics look only a tad better than African Americans. So with so few black and Hispanic students at the end of high school having superb academic skills, the pool of those who are ready to do the work demanded in highly selective colleges, likely to become part of the American professional and business elite, is inevitably very small. Now, black students were, of course, even further behind 3 decades ago when NAEP first began to report results. But the modest progress that occurred in the 1970s through much of the 1980s came to a screeching halt around 1988, and the gap has widened since then. So current trends offer no grounds for complacency. At a conference a number of years ago, a distinguished educator said to me, "Why are you talking about the racial gap when social class is the real issue? We wish it were true. Of course, parental education, income, place of residence, they all play a part, but they amount to about only a third of the gap, and they explain only about a third of the gap. And in part, we argue, group cultural differences explain the remaining 2/3. We use the word culture with a great deal of reluctance, but we could not think of another embracing term. And again, that's something we'd be delighted to talk more about in the question period. But everyone knows this point, really. Meeting the demands of school is harder for some racial and ethnic groups than for others. Some group cultures are more academically advantageous than others. Everybody's long known the point about Jews. Asians typically do, as I've already said, very well in school. Their parents expect their children to work extraordinarily hard, and the children do so. Cutting classes less often than their peers. This is all based on data. This is not speculation. It's not anecdotal. Cutting classes less often than their peers, enrolling in AP courses at triple the white rate, spending twice as much time on homework as their non-Asian classmates. The result, as I've already mentioned, is that on some math tests, the white-Asian gap is larger than the black-white gap. But hard work is a culturally transferable trait. Whites can work as hard as Asians on math, and so can everybody else. And schools, culture is not something permanent, written in the sky. It is shaped and reshaped by the environment, and schools can play an invaluable part in shaping the habits and the skills that we call culture, for want of a better word. We argue that Hispanics are an immigrant group, much like Italians around 1910, and it's clear that if you break the data down by generations, clear they're moving up over time. it is African Americans, both because of the picture of achievement, but also because of the historical story and the sense, correctly, that it is to African Americans that we really owe an all-out effort to level the educational playing field in this country. It is African Americans and their picture that is of greatest moral concern. First signs of underachievement appear very early in the life of black children. Scholars have yet to pinpoint the precise reasons. They can identify, however, some of the risk factors, and they are low birth rate, weight, single-parent households, birth to a very young mother. Black children not only arrive in school less academically well prepared, they arrive less ready to conform to behavioral demands, and they watch an extraordinary amount of television, essential, they say in surveys, to belonging to their peer culture. The process of connecting the typical black child to the world of academic achievement isn't easy under the best of educational settings, but good schools show it can be done. My favorite school, I've been wandering around the country for 5 years looking at schools, basically. My favorite school is the KIPP Academy in the South Bronx in New York. But it's not the only great school, and these schools show a roadmap to academic success. These schools all have greatly expanded instructional time, more hours in the day, longer weeks, longer years. They have terrific principals who have the authority and the autonomy to manage their budgets, set salaries, staff the school with fabulous teachers, and get rid of those who do not work out. These schools focus relentlessly on the core academic subjects, and they insist that their students learn the times table, basic historical facts, spelling, punctuation, rules of grammar, and the meaning of often unfamiliar words. They provide safe and orderly environments in which to teach and learn, but they also aim to transform the culture of their students as that culture affects academic achievement. Gregory Hodge, the head of the Frederick Douglass Academy in Harlem, once said to me, "Are we conservative here?" Asking me the question rhetorically, of course, and answered, "Of course we are. We teach middle-class values like responsibility." The KIPP Academy's David Levin, one of the founders, has echoed Hodge. He said, "We are fighting a battle involving skills and values. We are not afraid to set social norms." The best schools do indeed work hard to instill the desire, the discipline, the dedication, those are KIPP watchwords, that will enable disadvantaged youth to climb the ladder of economic and social opportunity. Figuring out what great schools look like is really not hard. How to get there on a massive scale, nobody has a good answer to that question. In my view, in our view, public education as it's structured today is full of built-in obstacles to the sort of fundamental reform that will be needed. And in a long chapter, we describe those daunting obstacles, which include the collective bargaining agreements that govern almost all aspects of a school day in many states. Will the mandatory testing and standard and other aspects of No Child Left Behind help? We believe that they will, if the legislation survives, but we believe they will. But they won't be sufficient to basically alter the picture the disappointing results of state-level reforms suggest. The longer we worked on no excuses, the more radical our voices became. The mind-numbing data, which I've just given you a peek at, on the racial gap in academic achievement, should make all Americans furious. And it should radicalize the debate over educational reform. Racial progress in so many ways has been so heartening in my lifetime. But in a society committed to equal opportunity, we still have a racially identifiable group of educational have-nots. Young African Americans and Latinos whose opportunities in life will almost inevitably be limited by their inadequate education. The alternative to a radical overhaul of American education is too many Black and Latino youngsters continuing to leave high school without the skills and knowledge that they need to do well in American life. Doors closed to too many non-Asian minority students. The perpetuation of ancient inequalities. Is that acceptable? No decent American says yes. Thanks.
Okay, well, that's the overview. I'll talk a little more narrowly about a few points. I should say at the outset that Abby and I do not disagree at all about the seriousness of the problem our book addresses or the urgency doing something about it. It's simply that I don't like the word crisis. This crisis mongering goes on too much, but whether you want to call it a crisis, it's a very serious and urgent and immediate problem. Now, I should say that neither of us come from a background in educational research. Abby was trained as a political scientist, and her expertise is really in the field of American constitutional law, and particularly race and the law. I'm a social historian who's done a lot of more or less demographic work, quantitative social history involving immigrant groups and racial groups in American cities. So there may be subtleties to educational research we don't fully grasp as outsiders, and we certainly are aware of the fact that when we moved into this topic that the literature was immense and that we could not cover it. We felt we wanted to write a book that covered the magnitude and significance of the racial gap, that reviewed the conventional explanations of that gap, not enough money spent on high minority schools and the like, and see if they in fact worked. And then to go on, assuming we found that those explanations didn't work, to come up with some better ones, and a major part of our interest to think through the policy issues and to come up with some kinds of recommendations. So I would stress that the work, though there certainly is a clear and strong argument, is exploratory, and that we may well have missed significant studies that would qualify our conclusions. Indeed, later on I'll mention a little research we've done since the book that in a certain way runs a bit counter to the central policy emphasis in it. So, as Ivy suggested, we document the horrendous magnitude of the racial gap. We review the literature on and the controversy over whether testing itself, measures anything meaningful, and make, we hope, a strong case that yes, indeed, scores on good tests, in fact, are strong indicators of levels of cognitive skills, and that those skills are very important to develop in our children. We argue that, contrary to the views of many, that social class, alas, does not explain these racial disparities. It explains a rather modest part of them. To do that, much of the original research in the book is using the National Assessment of Educational Progress data, and those of you thinking about term papers and master's theses and so on, there is a remarkable source that makes research in NAEP results very convenient. The NAEP data tool. You can go online, call up this thing, you decide you're interested in fourth grade math scores in Alabama versus Rhode Island, and you can find out what those scores are. You can break them down by race. You can further break them down by eligibility for free or reduced lunch program. You can break them down by central city, suburban residents. Just with the flick of some fingers, you can call up these tables. Now, there are lots of things you can't do. If you had your own real full database, there are many kinds of analysis you could do that you can't with NAEP. You basically get cross-tabulations. And you can use, it will create tests of statistical significance as well. So it is a remarkable source, and there are, with some of the tests, literally hundreds of variables. I mean, there are like 200 teacher variables in the math NAEPs, for example, at the 8th grade level. So it is extraordinarily rich. So we don't think it's social class. We make a strong argument, I think, that it isn't differences in availability of resources in terms of money spent on schools. And I thought I would take a little time, a few sentences more at least, to say it's not the supposed resegregation that at least one famous researcher at this very institution thinks is the source of the problem. I have great respect for Gary Orfield, whose research has been indefatigable and extremely valuable. He has monitored trends of school segregation for a very long time. But I do think there are great limitations to this work, and I refer, for example, the latest report just out with the Harvard Civil Rights Project has a table on enrollments in the 27 largest central city school districts, and Professor Orfield calculates the index of exposure of minorities to whites. Separate indexes for black exposure to whites and Latino exposure to whites. And in cities, it starts with New York. The index of exposure of blacks to whites is only 6.6. The average black student will have only 6.6% white in his or her school. And you go over this whole table and you find there is one shining example of what Professor Orfield would consider integration. Just one of the 27 cities, and that is Salt Lake City, where blacks are very highly exposed to whites, and so are Latinos. And much of Professor Orfield's report measures simply what percentage of minority students are going to schools that have a white majority. And he regards any school that does not have a white majority as a segregated school. And it is bad to attend segregated schools. And I must say, I have to say this is a somewhat quaint and outmoded conception, it seems to me. Professor Orfield's own table shows that only one of those 27 districts has a white majority now. And again, surprise, it's Salt Lake City, that mecca of racial tolerance and integration, right? And it is very curious if you think about it. If you met someone on an airplane and were chatting with them and they said, I've got a job offer, Pittsburgh or any one of these 26 of the 27 cities, and I'm going to move there with my kids. It's a shame I of course won't send my children to the public schools. And you might well think something a little odd about their racial attitudes. This is pretty deplorable, I'm not going to send my kids to the schools because they don't have a white majority in the school district. But then this person says, you know, I never thought this way, but I read this report by this Harvard professor, Professor Orfield, and Professor Orfield tells me that you really need majority white schools for students to learn. That once you're in a segregated school, that's really terrible. So I can understand this way of thinking back when the racial minority elements of the population were much smaller, but it's very hard for me to understand why you would continue to take such a crude measure and to continue to assume without a white majority things are not likely to be very good educationally, in light of the fact that Professor Orfield's own reports indicate that over the past 30 years we've gone to a public school from his public school enrollment, which was almost 80% white, down to 61% at last count. And if you simply extrapolate a little, and as far as we know, Hispanic immigration is not going to stop, it's clear that within 20 years or so, our whole society's public school enrollment will be majority non-white. Now, I don't think those categories are very meaningful, but that's another issue. So I'm wondering what Professor Orfield would have us do. Slit our throats? Give up? It seems to me somewhat, insulting almost to think that if you have a majority of non-white students in a school system or in a particular school, you've got terrible problems. We just don't see it that way. Now, and indeed, already the state of California, whites are down to 36% of public school enrollments. So are we going to write off our largest state with 10% of the American population as kind of educationally hopeless, or do we have to introduce, instead of busing, jet planing students to other states where there's still some whites? Presumably contact with whites will be uplifting. It's very curious in my view, and I am somewhat disappointed that this sort of work is so uncritically reported in the New York Times, Washington Post, places like that. We're just heading for disaster. Our schools are resegregating because there are fewer and fewer schools that have white majorities. Now, the final point I want to make briefly, and I hope this does suggest we are open to changing our mind when the evidence presents itself. Recently, NAEP, which started as a national level study back in 1990, began to do separate state level assessments on a voluntary basis, and now all states must do NAEPs as part of the No Child Left Behind legislation. But NAEP began in 2002 on a small scale, and then last year on a somewhat larger scale, to study certain selected urban districts. And last year they examined in 4th and 8th grade reading and math skills in 10 cities. Los Angeles, New York, Boston, Houston, etc. Now, one of the 10 doesn't really fit. It was Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and that is not a central city district, but of course famous in the history of desegregation legislation, the Swan case. That is a district that is more than 2/3 suburban. So I haven't paid much attention to that, but I did start playing around with the numbers on the other 9 and found that it's quite interesting. When you look at it, you see, for example, in math, there are stunning differences in overall average scores between Houston on the top and Los Angeles on the bottom. That by the 8th grade, those scores are different on the order of kind of 2 grade levels. The 8th graders in Houston are coming out with a command of math which is the equivalent of 2 years more than those in Los Angeles or in Washington, D.C. Well, now, of course, the racial mix, the social class mix could vary a lot. So with the NAEP data tool, you can get into that. So you can pull out, for example, just African-American students who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So that's the only poverty indicator we have, and it's very crude, but, you know, it's worth something. And so if you look at just poor black kids in Washington, D.C., and compare them to Houston, the difference is just as large. And the difference between performance of black children in D.C. and in Houston is 2/3 as large as the average difference between whites and blacks nationally. So Houston is doing something right, and D.C. is doing something horribly wrong. And Los Angeles is pretty much indistinguishable from D.C. So that discovery forced us to reconsider the generalization we would have made, which is basically the urban, vast, bureaucratic urban systems we have in our central cities are beyond reform. They just can't do anything right, and that the public school monopoly needs to be broken up. We need a multiplication of charter schools. We are strong advocates of low-income vouchers and welcome the experiment with vouchers in D.C., which has just been voted by Congress. But this finding did suggest to me in the summer we're going to try to look into this more deeply and try to figure out what it is that they're doing so wrong in D.C. or so right in Houston or some combination thereof. So there may be some policy implications of that little project that would lead one to think of things one could do to improve the Boston schools, the St. Louis schools, or whatever. It would not be as radical as we were predisposed to believe before that. Nonetheless, I do think the case for providing more in the way of parental choice and more in the way of competition for the existing public schools is essential to any major progress in narrowing the racial gap that we think is such a central problem.
Guys, your game come back up. We'll open this up for questions or comments. We have 2 mics at on either side. And if you would please just identify yourselves. And questions and comments, yes. Speeches, save for another occasion. Please, Micah.
Hopefully I can do this.
Good luck.
My name's
That's
Micah.
Multitasking, I
Yes,
believe.
it is.
Oh, how adorable.
Thank you. My name's Micah Pollock, and I'm on the faculty here at the school. And my question is about, first of all, I want to applaud you for your for denouncing the racial achievement gap. I think that's a very important act in any discussion about the achievement gap. My concern is about the explanation that you're offering in your book. And that concern is because a couple of reasons. One is you say that you set out to sort of to investigate and then sort of weigh the most common explanations for the racial achievement gap, and it seems that what the sort of black children, the culture of black children is anathema to educational achievement. That's in fact one of the most common explanations for the racial achievement gap, and my fear is that there are a couple of fears with sort of making that the central argument that you promote to the public. One is that you're clearly interested in galvanizing resistance to the racial achievement gap, galvanizing the public to work to dismantle that gap. But that explanation to me has been, since it is one of the sort of oldest narratives in American race history, besides the blacks are genetically incapable argument, which I know you're not making, Given that that is such a sort of common, that particular argument is one of sort of, in my mind, the most stultifying arguments to make, because it makes the achievement gap itself seem inevitable. And it sounds like many scholars have actually sort of demonstrated that's not the culture of Group X at all, but rather a sort of larger cultural arrangement that presumes that black students are culturally against academic achievement. That is the problem. That it's a context of black students that is the problem, rather than the stuff inherent to their culture. And so, sorry, I know you asked not for speeches. My question is whether you think that promoting this argument actually will galvanize people, or rather, my fear is what it will do is promote a sense of inevitability about the racial achievement gap and take the lens of investigation off of all the people surrounding black students, who seem to be really those who are succeeding in the schools that you are mentioning and lauding, and they're succeeding by precisely believing that it's not anything about the culture of black students that causes the racial achievement gap, but rather what they themselves do. So that's my question, is about the argument you're making, its potential effect on the public in naturalizing the racial achievement gap itself as a problem of black students rather than the adults around them.
Okay, well, I think that's an excellent question. I would say, first, in the traveling we've done talking about this book, and Abby's done more of it than I had, but we have been before many audiences, I have not picked up questions that indicate that's how the book was being received. Now, we agonized over the use of this term culture. It is so loaded, and as you know, there are some anthropologists who have purged the term from all of their writings. But most of them, then find something that sort of points to more or less the same thing, and so it's just a pseudonym. What we mean by culture perhaps could better have been called cultural/behavioral patterns. And what we have in mind, and I would say I've read dozens of articles that are examining students and student attitudes about learning, and I would say every one of these articles I'm thinking of says there is a problem with black students' engagement with school. There are lower levels of school engagement and kind of cooperation with, involvement in the enterprise than there are among other groups. And there are higher levels of engagement also among Asians than among whites. And that's really what we mean by culture, that there is a series of behavioral patterns, which includes, for example, a phenomenal amount of watching television, where half of all black children in the 4th and 8th grade watch 6 or more hours a day during the school week, which is double the white average. And it seems to us that undoubtedly has something to do with the level of engagement and quality of engagement with their homework. Now, the schools we talk about as models that seem to do so splendidly are not schools that say, oh, there are no cultural issues here. These, indeed, are schools that are quite conscious of the fact that their mission is to change the culture. They see a culture of the street that they're trying to rescue these kids from. And one reason they have a phenomenal, they have school from like 7:30 to 5:30 and on Saturday and in the summer, is that it keeps the kids busy doing something creative and keeps them from having the time to be caught up in the culture these teachers are trying to help them escape from. Now, that doesn't mean they are going to escape from black culture in general and are going to reject their racial origins. Or, we are talking about only those behavioral patterns that cannot be explained purely in terms of social class differences that seem to have a racial dimension, that are inhibiting learning. And it certainly has nothing to do with what kind of music you like or any way, how you worship or anything else that we would say would be part of African American culture. It's very long-winded.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things. I mean, I'm puzzled by the comment that it's a message that kind of dampens the movement for educational reform. I mean, we're delivering a message here that it seems to me conservatives particularly have been very resistant to, which is that it is not enough for schools, particularly dealing with inner city kids, to confine their efforts to teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, that there is a broader education that is absolutely essential here. And it seems to me that the best schools, in effect, looked at their school population and said to themselves, we know what these kids need, aside from, of course, needing to at least be able to code switch from playground English into standard English if they're going to get along in the world and be able to have a grasp of math and history and so forth. But on top of that, they are dealing in the inner city with school populations that need to learn to organize their work, to get to school every day on time, to be dressed for success, as it were, to shake hands, to look people in the eye when they talk, a set of skills that, for better or worse, I would call cultural, but that these schools do embrace as part of their mission. And so our message is, don't define education in the narrow terms that a lot of people want to define it in, because it's got to be defined very broadly if you're going to pull kids who are highly disadvantaged onto the ladder of economic and social mobility in America. So I'm trying to get schools to do something. I mean, they'll say, we're not social workers. Well, you got kids you need to rescue. And that's a very large project, and it involves more than teaching math.
Yeah, it's great to have an opportunity to debate and discuss. Just to follow up, I think that I support the sort of detailed analysis of need that you're talking about, and I think many, many people in the education profession support that need also. It's more, I think it's the way you frame your argument, though, is about Black culture's approach to educational achievement, not about the specific needs of specific kids growing up in specific settings. And I'm not advocating a colorblind approach by any means. I think that we have to consider how race factors the picture of educational attainment. But the argument you're making is about Black culture and its approach to education. That's how you frame your argument, I should say. Mm-hmm. And that leads to a very different cultural conversation than let's have detailed analyses of student needs. This is a very different way of framing for the public what it is you think what the problem is in your mind.
Well, if I said to you, look, I don't think anybody in this room would argue about the history of blacks in this country and the fact that if you lived not only under slavery, but in the Jim Crow South, that there were very limited educational opportunities, and education was no ticket to social mobility because, of course, there was, first place, the schools were terrible. Second place, there was a real ceiling on where you were going to go in America with the wrong color skin. That if I were to argue to you that out of that history came a radical disengagement from seeing education as a ticket of mobility in America, very, very different than what the Jews have traditionally seen it as, for instance, or what Asians coming to this country see it as. In fact, the immigrant pattern is very different. I can't believe you would disagree with me putting that kind of disengagement in a historical context. I had an interesting conversation at a Boston charter school just 2 days ago, in which I had a conversation about this with a class, mostly black kids, and all these hands went up. I mean, I talked about the way I think about these things, and all these hands went up. And it turned out that most of the students in this charter school were black immigrants. And they said, why don't you make a distinction? And I said, well, actually, one should make a distinction between immigrants in general. They do come with different hopes and different expectations and a different level of energy, or at least, we're talking averages here. And unfortunately, we can't break the data down for, within this group that we label black. But, I mean, it makes historical sense, just as it does for Jews, to say that there are different group relationships to the world of academic learning.
Next. Can I go?
Yes, I'd like to continue with this line of thinking. My name's Paula Kaplan. I've done a lot of research on cognition and achievement. And it seems to me that there's a parallel between what was said for a long time about girls and women not being able to do math and science because the way our culture was, if not our genes, we just cared about feelings and friends, and we didn't like having to, do right and wrong problems and questions. It threatened us. And it seems to me there's a parallel in terms of what we look at as cause and what we look at as effect. I'm thinking, of course, of Steele's work on stereotype threat, which I think is really essential to bring to bear here. And it seems to me that if you say, well, the cause is black culture or female socialization, female culture, and that's what we have to change, instead of changing the message that we don't care what your racial classification is, we don't care what your sex is, we're not going to assume that we know how you can learn and whether you can learn and how you can perform just because of what your group membership is. And I've seen a lot of charter schools and different kinds of schools in which, yes, you do see very big differences in achievement and drive and motivation and so on, but I don't think it's because you're taking people out of black culture or out of female culture. You're simply giving them the message that you may be black, but that doesn't say anything to us about how you can achieve, or you may be female. Same kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the message in these schools is, I don't know where the disagreement is. First place, we never suggest that this is a question of ability. I mean, you said, there's an analogy, the old message, women couldn't do math, they couldn't think in linear terms, somebody once said to me, you think like a man. And I thought, what? But this isn't a question of ability. This is a question of hard work and delivering the right messages in the schools. Absolutely, all kids can learn. I mean, obviously, we've got individuals. This is not a racial statement. It's a statement about individuals. Some are more academically oriented at the end of the day than others, but that shouldn't have anything to do with the color of one's skin. So I with the message that you're talking about, which is a message these schools do deliver. We're going to open doors for you. At the end of the day, you got to decide whether you're going to walk through them. But we're going to open doors for you, and you can make it. Is in any way something different than what I've been talking about, or we've been talking about.
Well, if I could just clarify, and then I'll sit down. What I think that the concern is that it's not. Let me say it this way. I think you could make a good argument that goes like this: without changing black culture, or should we say cultures, and without changing the way girls and women are socialized, we could change achievement and motivation if we didn't, as a dominant culture, make people who grew up in these other cultures or with these various group memberships feel like we assume you're not going to be able to do that. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a question of whether you think the problem comes from a racist and sexist culture that's making assumptions about subcultures or whatever, or group membership, or whether you think it comes from what happens in those different group environments.
Well, it seems to me a little strange you are giving such power to the culture of the dominant group and are so unwilling to say there could be anything in the culture of a not dominant group that might be holding them back. And I also think, to the extent to which that analysis, you accept that sort of analysis, what program of educational reform follows from it? Surely teachers in education schools today are taught that all children can learn, and there are all these mantras. They have been programmed to claim to believe, at least, everyone has great potential that can be untapped. So, and stereotype threat. If you say, is that not a cultural? Is not vulnerability to a stereotype threat a cultural pattern that needs to be overcome? And it cannot be overcome simply by changing the larger society. I don't know how you do that to begin with. But if the stereotype threat is perceived in the minds of black students in the Claude Steele case, then how can its damaging effects be overcome unless black consciousness changes, unless students learn to become invulnerable to the stereotype threat?
But then you're saying that the problem is in the targets of racism rather than the problem is in...
I'm saying the problem is all around, and that to exempt the targets, how does the mechanism of stereotype threat work unless it's in the minds, according to Claude Steele, of the black students taking the SATs, right? Well, how did it get there? It's affecting their performance. It can't be, it's been internalized.
It happens to white students as well.
We're getting...
Yeah, well...
we have a lineup of other people.
Okay.
We may come back to this.
Except that I want to say one sentence, that there is no evidence that black teachers are more effective with black students than white teachers. That is very important to that whole discussion. Go, sir.
Yeah, my name is Paul Haas. I'm a graduate of the School of Education, 1983, Administration, Planning, and Social Policy. A practical question for you. In 2 weeks, the Boston School Committee is due to address the issue of student assignment. What recommendations would you two have for this committee?
Well, I've long been an opponent of race-based assignments. I think it's very, very important that parents, to the degree possible, choose the schools that their children go to. And in every good school that I have seen, one of the questions, the obvious questions I've posed is, could you do this if the families and the teachers as well had not chosen to be at that school. All of these schools have huge applicant piles. The students are chosen randomly from the applicant pool, but there's obviously a self-selection bias here, and you do end up with a group of families and students who want to be in a school with that particular program and that particular educational culture. And the answer is always, to me, no. We could not function in a school in which the parents, the children, and the teachers had not chosen to be here. And that does not mean that all children will choose the same sort of school or belong in the same sort of school, or that there's one educational program that's right, but that some match between the conception of the school, the culture of the school, and the student and their parents and the teachers who end up being there is essential. So I want as much school choice as Boston can possibly provide.
Hi, my name is John Almeida. I'm a PhD student in sociology and social policy. I want to make three points. I read your book, and I've read a number of the studies that you quote in your book. First, on this race and culture issue, I think it would be helpful if the claims were qualified a little bit, because what we know is from the Jenks and Phillips volume, which is where I assume you got this fact that a third to half of the racial achievement gap
that's the Phillips work,
right. So it's a big jump
our
from
NAEP analysis.
Our NAEP analysis as well, that's right.
But it's a big jump from there to say that the other two-thirds, half to two-thirds, is explained by culture. There's no quantitative...
Partly is what
There's no quantitative evidence on that. In fact, the quantitative evidence tends to refute this, if you think about the Cook and Ludwig and so on. I don't want to go into all of this, but the cultural evidence actually seems to be more qualitative and anecdotal and less quantitative. So if we're going to go with the hard data, we don't have hard data on culture, except for, I do think there's a fair point to be made about immigrants, which I think sort of confuses the question in that, of course, immigrants have higher motivation. They're a self-selected group. They come because they want to be educated. So it may well be that there's somewhat of a cultural explanation that explains why Asian Americans do better in schools, but that doesn't necessarily explain differences between blacks and whites. There's significant anti-intellectualism in white culture and so forth, and there's no quantitative data on that point. Second point has to do with class. It's true that class can't explain the racial achievement gap, but it's also true that race can't explain the class achievement gap. So we shouldn't sort of throw off the table. There are huge differences in class that are persistent. We don't even have good data on the NAEP because the kids can't report their parents' income, so we don't know exactly how those have been over time, but fair to say they're large and they're not getting any smaller. And then the third point on the charter schools, you sort of stress with the KIPP Academy and so on the importance of responsibility, discipline, sort of conservative virtues. And I think you could come back and you could say there are also charter schools which, while sort of maintaining high standards, do it in a more progressive way, are more focused on interest, engagement, and so forth. So if that were true, then we could sort of bypass this pedagogical debate. And perhaps I think the most interesting thing you said was it's easy to create some good schools. It's difficult to bring it to scale. If what makes a school good is the quality of the teachers itself, regardless of whether they sort of employ a conservative or progressive pedagogy, then the question is, how can we create a huge number of people who are of that quality who want to teach? And then we're back to sort of very simple resource distribution issues. And so I guess one question that comes out of this is for your conservative friends, colleagues, congressmen, et cetera. Where is the money for, this was recommended in Nation at Risk, and it was one part of Nation at Risk that never got picked up on, which was take our young people and take people who are graduating from college and make teaching as an attractive an option as it is to become a consultant in iBanker, what all my friends did out of college. And so where is the sort of the passion for that issue, and also for the whole opportunity to learn standards, which was the other part, the fourth part of this whole standards accountability, that there were going to be things in place for kids to make sure that kids had the opportunity to really achieve the standards. Another part which seems to have sort of dropped out of the mainstream rhetoric on this issue.
Well, let me take up the latter part of that. We could talk about many of these things at length. I would point out, first of all, that per pupil spending in real dollars in this country since 1960 has increased 240%. I would point out that the pupil-teacher ratio over the same period has dropped 40%. The percentage of teachers with master's degrees has gone from 23 to 54. We should have wonderful results from those huge investments in real resources, inflation-controlled dollars, and we don't see that. Second, I would say the notion that teachers are, in general, terribly underpaid, I would have to question. They look to be that way only when you consider their wages on an annual basis and ignore the fact that they work a shorter work week and a much shorter school year, so that a study with 2002 data shows that elementary students, teachers today earn an average of $30.28 and secondary teachers 50 cents more, which is exactly where accountants, mechanical engineers, a whole range of people who went often through more rigorous education and certainly had higher SAT scores on the average. Now, my conclusion from that is I would like to pay teachers a lot more. I would like to pay the top quarter of existing teachers a lot more. I would like to get rid of the bottom quarter or more, and I would like to attract much more academically talented people into the system, and I'd be happy to pay them twice as much. But I don't want to pay, we've got 3 million teachers in this country. If we paid them all a lot more, $20,000 a year, that wouldn't make them rich. $20,000 a year would work out to be $60 billion. It's totally insane. If we had a system of merit pay, and if we had a system to recruit, and pay at a higher salary, I would like to pay at a higher salary those gifted teachers who would work in the most difficult and challenging inner city schools. At the moment, those teachers start there with idealism. There's no possibility of making any more money by staying there. So when they get tired of that difficult scene, they move to a kind of safer, quieter, more pleasant, upper middle class school. I'd like to give them financial incentives to stay where they're doing so well. But, of course, that runs against all of the teacher union demands and, indeed, the basic system of rewarding teachers, even in states where teachers' unions are not very powerful. It's a radically egalitarian pay scale that I think is totally unsuited to excellence.
I want to say something on this, too, but I do want you to say something about the question of that he started with, which is, because it's more your question than mine, on the paucity of data, on the argument that we make that we call
Well, I do think it's basically a semantic question. There certainly is ample quantitative data suggesting differences in TV viewing, differences in amount of time spent in homework, and a wealth of studies, though not a nationally representative sample, suggesting, as I mentioned earlier, lower levels of school engagement. That's what we're calling culture. You could call it something else if you can think of a better word, but after all, the word culture, I was reminded, we often talk about the school culture. But when we talk about the culture of a school, there aren't these implications. Oh my God, that must go back to Puritan days or something. The culture of a school can change often quite rapidly. And we are talking about cultural patterns or behavioral patterns that also can be changed, and that some schools are demonstrably changing these charters we talk about.
Let me say something on the teaching. If you go through Harvard Graduate School, Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and get a PhD, let's say, in history or government, the chances are very good you're going to end up, given the market, you're going to end up at...
Unemployed.
Unemployed, or in a place you don't really want to live, and that pays, and where the job pays very, very badly, and the teaching load is very heavy. You're going to University of Mobile, Alabama. Believe me, I don't want to insult anybody here who comes from Mobile, Alabama, but in my view, having spent a bit of time in Mobile, you don't want, if possible, don't want to teach there. The pay is lower at such places than public school teachers get. The process of getting a PhD is long, it's agonizing, it's infuriating in many ways. And what is the difference that people want those jobs and stick with those jobs? The work conditions are different, and the whole profession is different. And it seems to me that in order to get the academically highly skilled college graduates who are also idealistic and want to turn kids' lives around into the teaching profession, we're going to have to change that profession so that the work conditions are very different and the job is very different. For one thing, you're not doing the same thing at age 25 that you would do at age 60 unless you go into administration.
What about the progressive charter schools?
The progressive charter schools.
Isn't there one in L.A. that you...
There's one in L.A. I'm about to look at. Yeah, I haven't seen it. I haven't been to one that I thought had been properly evaluated and was really working. But look, great teachers and great principals produce great results, I'm sure. I just haven't seen a school that fit your model of less of an insistence on, for instance, learning the times table and a belief that kids will learn it when they're kind of ready to and interested in doing so. That's a luxury it seems to me, for the kids that I'm most concerned about.
I mean, you're the product of a famous progressive school, Hessian Hills, which no longer
And
exists.
the Little Red Schoolhouse in New York, yes, I am. These were schools that didn't teach anything. It isn't so costly with a middle-class kid. Though my kids still tease me about what I didn't learn in elementary and secondary school. But anyway, yeah.
Hi, my name is Patricia Cercada, and I'm an alumni student of Graduate School of Education. I actually did international education policy and then decided to go into the urban so-called disadvantaged school district here in the U.S. Being an immigrant myself, I wanted to really see what it was all about, and I actually went into a charter school. I teach elementary school, and I would love to tackle the issue of teachers and pay and all that interesting things, but it's really fascinating to me that we focus more on qualified teachers and getting them through college and what it takes to really get skilled teachers, when in actuality it's been my experience that when you're in the classroom with your students, that is where you get your best education. And yes, information, literature is all very important, and to think that teachers don't continue that education throughout the year is very alarming to me. And I think that us in the field, those of us who actually teach, know that and know the importance of that. Having said that, I would really, really be interested to tackle the issue of your argument towards Gary Orfield's argument. And it really amazes me because I was fortunate enough to take a class with him and read a lot of his research. And I really think that what he's getting at is not that, schools with white kids are better off, or 60% enrollment of white kids is better than a school with 90% enrollment. I don't think that's his only point. 90% enrollment, maybe all poverty concentrated black schools. But his point is that there's a deeper thing in what we call the culture of the behavior of the African American or the black immigrant student, which I would beg to make very distinct separations of those. He would argue that basically all these things have a link to housing and have a link to what you're bringing into the school. And as a teacher, I see that every single day. I have African American students that perform very highly, that they excel, that I know they're going to go to college. I also have students who have been put in front of the TV because their parents can't afford to be with their kids 24 hours a day or doing work with their kids. And I think that applies to a lot of our families. So for you to say that, you know, the culture of watching TV 6 hours a day, or the culture of this or the culture of that, I think there's a deeper issue there. We are not stepping aside from, you know, really just looking at education and trying to fund education, trying to remedy education. We're not trying to go beyond that and say, okay, well, how can we talk about housing and how we plan our cities and how we build our cities so that there isn't white flight, so that there isn't, you know, a parent who decides that, oh, I can go afford a house in a more affluent community where my students are going to get the best education. And, you know, we're really here focusing on education alone, when in actuality education brings to the table a slew of things. So my question to you is, what is your idea, given that you say that, you know, us teachers need to be everything, which I agree, I am everything to my students. What is your thoughts on how housing and how our policies in housing and how we lay out our cities basically are in relation to the fact that there is an achievement gap? Because I don't think we can just look at culture and race. And, you know, what is your input on housing and how it affects?
We'll both answer this. Let me first say something about it. I agree with you that professional development, the best professional development, goes on in the classroom, and I want to see more mentoring in the schools, and I want to see principals who are instructional leaders in the schools instead of principals who are locked in their offices.
Who have never taught themselves.
And who have never taught themselves and are never in the classrooms. I've talked to more young teachers who say, I need help, and the principal has never been in my classroom, not once the entire year.
That was my experience in the charter school.
Right, and I do not believe in, you know, professional development in the form of some course that's irrelevant to what you're doing. And a friend of mine is trying to teach teachers, elementary school teachers, math, and finding an astonishing number do not really understand basic arithmetic. I want teachers who have to teach math, even arithmetic, to have had math courses and not math ed courses in college. And look, on the housing question, and Steve will speak to this too, I'm sure he has something to say. You're not talking about white flight. You're talking about black flight as well. You're talking about
Asian flight,
Hispanic flight. People move when they can afford it out of the central cities. That is a fact of American life. I don't know how to fix that. What I do know is that the schools are obligated to teach the kids who walk through their door, and they're not doing a good enough job.
I certainly agree with that, and I appreciate that comment. My concern is that I work at a charter school, and I've been studying a lot of other choice schools, and my concern is that if in a perfect world we could certainly pay teachers more and get qualified teachers, I still debate the fact that in a perfect world, what these really good, choice schools are doing is they're making up for a lot of the things that these kids are not bringing into the classroom. So it's really important for us to think about, well, in a perfect world, we'd all have, schools like the KIPP school in South Bronx. But the reality of it is that, there are scarce resources to go around. And even if I had a perfect school and a perfect faculty, I would still have kids whose parents, regardless of what their race is, regardless of what their situation is, their parents are in such a condition that they need to pay bills and that they need to have 2 jobs at times. I have a lot of students in that case. So that for you to make, I would really just enjoy seeing you branching out from thinking that this is specifically, a culture of behavior or whatnot, but also looking at how all the social issues that are going on are going to still keep coming into the school.
We don't deny that.
Yeah, although, I do have to say, I thought that was a very thoughtful comment, but, you say, well, in a perfect world, we'd have more KIPP academies and so on, but of course it isn't a perfect world. But then it seems to me what you're really asking for is a much more perfect world in which no one has to work 2 jobs to survive, in which there is always an adult home when the kids come home from school, in which the neighborhood is rich with
No, I'm
different
actually just
resources.
saying that we can't just focus on education. We need to focus on housing policies, health care policies. I mean, you look at Codman Academy in Dorchester, they've put together a plan where kids get health care and where they get a lot of other resources that most families don't get.
Well, maybe they can do something about health care, but housing policy, very little housing in the United States is controlled by the government. It's controlled by a private market, and people make choices with the resources they have. And it's awfully hard to think of fundamentally altering that until the socialist revolution comes and all housing is nationalized. You know.
Yeah, two more people want to get in later.
Thanks. You talked about you express a need to change black culture, and you also talk about this need to change the individual behaviors, and you try to link that to an achievement gap in the NAEP. However, educators know that the NAEP is not built to make assessments about individuals, because no individual takes a full part of the test in any content area. Yeah. So given that, and given the fact that you also present sort of broad data that is about schools, and I stress about schools because educators recognize that it's not, that your data is not about the process of schooling. It's not about what happens in the classroom. So I guess my question is a validity question, and the question is, how do you then, how do you justify the fact that in your book you're making recommendations about the appropriate way of schooling children when you haven't really supported that claim with your data? And especially, I was surprised to hear that it was KIPP schools that are that are actually funded by Don Fisher, who runs Banana Republic, and no, I was in a meeting with him actually when we talked about that.
That's incorrect. But anyway.
Maybe he lied to me, but I actually was in a meeting with him.
These are public charter schools.
They're public charter schools. He is providing the Fisher Foundation is simply providing the money to train KIPP leaders.
Well, I'm glad that they're not using the same model that they used to, make their clothes and stuff. But anyway,
yeah.
So my question is,
they're not
how
supporting schools.
But my question still is, so how do you, if your data is not about the process of schooling, how then do you justify making recommendations about how students should best be schooled?
Well, let me take the first part of this. It is true that NAEP, and this is one reason why you can't get the raw NAEP data through the NAEP data tool and do the kind of regression or whatever you would want to do, because in fact no student takes every part of the test, and they do a very elaborate composite weighting thing that I can't begin to understand. However, they take great pains to have large enough coverage of all racial and ethnic groups that they can create what they consider perfectly accurate mean scores and indeed distributions, so we know what a black student at the 90th percentile in the black distribution does, or at the 10th percentile. And I've never heard it argued that those estimates are questionable. Now, I didn't really follow, but maybe Abby did, your question about not having studied the process of schooling. You can't draw any conclusions. I mean, we have looked deeply into some particular schools. We've read what investigators write about the process of schooling, but I don't know. I mean, there are tens of thousands of schools with many more classrooms than that. I'm not quite sure what you would ask us to do before we make some arguments about how the system could be changed. But maybe you...
No, I have the same reaction.
We have two more people who want to be heard, and then we'll wind this up. So, here and then.
I wonder why, with the enormous literature there is now that supports the idea of racial differences in intelligence, why you can't recognize the validity. There are works by people like Michael Levin, Jean-Philippe Rushton, Hans Eysenck, a whole number of people. These are very excellent studies done by very articulate, literate, intelligent people. And I think there's something, you know, I mean, there is something in this, you know, perhaps it goes against the grain of some people. There is a kind of, perhaps there is a kind of sentimentality which wants to believe in the viability of multiracial, multi-ethnic societies. I think that's maybe where a lot of the real problem exists in this country. We've got to come to the point where we recognize that people are different. They have different cultures, different moral sensibilities, different intellectual abilities, and I think it's rather incredible to listen to this whole discussion and have no fair discussion of the evidence of racial differences.
Let me take that. The one thing I'm sorry about in the book, since we devote whole short chapters to dismissing certain explanations, I think we have a long footnote or two. I think we should have had a short chapter on the IQ issue. And we do not think, in fact, that this is an IQ story. And you know, I could go on at great length about this, but one of the most powerful things is if you look at the racial gap on the NAEP, which begins in the early 70s, you find blacks 1.2, 1.3 standard deviations below the white mean. By the late 80s, in reading, that gap had been cut to 0.48. In math, it was down to about 0.7. And then the gap, alas, kind of leveled off and widened again. Now, how can this be explained in terms of genetic, fluctuations over such a short period of time? And indeed, Herrnstein and Murray wrestle with the NAEP data in the bell curve and do a terribly sloppy job, in my opinion, in attempting to kind of group that data in a way that's consistent with an IQ story. And Robert Hauser has done a very good analysis going back to identifying a lot of the shortcuts they took. So I just don't buy this as the explanation for our problem.
I'll try to keep it short. I've been sitting there listening to a lot of the comments, and I've been a teacher for near 10 years. I've taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And one of the comments that was made earlier, that this is not a question of ability, but more so hard work. And I'm just very curious how, especially the world that we live in, where children just on a whole are like the MTV generation, the BET generation, how it is that somehow the Latinos and black students are the ones who especially have to, we have to do like basic tap dance on tables or jump through hoops or do something to reach them, but not the Asian students or the white students. I just think that it leaves us with the idea that somehow black students and Latinos are predisposed to not learning normally like everyone else, and to say that it's a question of hard work, I think kind of dabbles into the whole issue of, well, they're predisposed to be lazy anyway. So I think that's a very dangerous rhetoric, and I'm quite disturbed by it.
Well, no, I mean, it's not what we said, or it's not, I think in this case, what I said. I mean, if I say, look, the data, we've got good data on black TV watching, and the number of hours spent is much greater than any other group, that's not a question saying something about blacks being predisposed to being lazy. That is simply saying there are habits here that interfere, patterns of behavior that interfere with school success. And it has nothing to do with predisposition, has nothing to do with genetic makeup or anything that, remotely connected to, we do have a racial gap in academic achievement. We're trying to get at how to close that gap. That gap is undeniable. We've been denying it too long in this country, shoving it under the rug, not being willing to talk about it. You don't fix a problem that you don't talk about.
This fulfilled my prediction that a provocative set of analyses and recommendations and a spirited and thank you for making it a civil dialogue with the Thurnstroms. Thank you very much for this evening.